They say that the first and most important reason history is taught is so it isn't repeated. But what happens when the history you view through an old lens is common in everyday life? History is present in our everyday lives across all fields and forms that we admire and aspire to be. This is especially the case when it comes to neurology, or more specifically the brain, and how studies have manipulated this field of science to take more control or to prove to another group of people that they are inadequate. With this in mind, today's video examines the role of historical bias in scientific studies of the brain, and it highlights how these biases have led to discrimination against minority groups. By deconstructing the past practices and prejudices, we aim to reveal the origins of bias and how they manifest into ongoing discrimination towards all former minorities. The first thing I will mention about how historical biases are used in a seemingly scientific lens is through the creation of the educational tests that are structured to create division and superiority within a country. One test in mind will be the Binet test, or rather the American revision made by Henry Goddard. Revised by Henry Goddard in 1910, the origins of this test stem from a French psychologist named Alfred Binet. It was in France in the summer of 1908 that Henry Goddard saw Binet's intelligence testing system during his 2-month trip to Europe to study methods other researchers were using in working with educationally challenged children. In France, public education was made mandatory, leading teachers to have children of many different backgrounds to teach. Because of this increase, many children were failing, and whether it was because of background, overall knowledge, or lack of schooling was unknown to everyone. In Binet's case, his IQ test was made to identify French children with developmental disabilities so that they can receive extra help in school. Binet was wary of the flaws that the test could bring if misused, especially in the case of this test being used as a scale for everyone has a fixed natural intelligence scale. According to a DePaul University research paper that looks into the eugenic origins of IQ testing that cites Binet's words in his book published in 1909, I'm saying this right, Les Indes modernes sur les enfants, Binet says, some recent thinkers seem to have given their moral support to these deplorable verdicts by affirming that an individual's intelligence is a fixed quantity, a quantity that cannot be increased. We must protest and react against this brutal pessimism. We must try to demonstrate that it is founded on nothing. This quote will be referring to Goddard's published and overly promoted version of the scale in December 1908, named the Binet-Simon Test of Intellectual Capacity. By 1911, Alfred Binet had died in Paris, and also in that year, Goddard would push for his test to be used nationwide, first with children in public schools and then eventually with immigrants at Ellis Island. Goddard would push for the use of his revised test, as evidenced by the usage of his test in a court of law. Additionally, he and others would support them to use it as an indicator of natural-born intelligence, but the results and conclusions he would make for these tests would be even madder. According to the eugenic origins of IQ testing implications of post-Atkins litigation, Goddard would scale the results of those he considered feeble-minded, a term that he used as a clinical category for people who scored below 70 on his intelligence test, into 3 different sections for mental incompetence. The first one being idiots, people who will score 0 to 20 on these IQ testing. Imbeciles, who were classified as illiterate, people who scored 20 to 40 on these IQ tests. And finally, morons, who were considered high-functioning people, or of the bunch that he considered, that scored about 40 to 70 on these tests. One method of his methodology, or one of the tests you'll do to establish this intelligence, innate intelligence that is, would be his Alpha Test 8 information, where there are several questions regarding American culture, or questions likely, in my opinion, questions likely only high-class citizens at this time with access would know the answers to these questions. These questions, I'll leave the picture of it or whatever, but I'll just say these questions here. These questions include Christy Mathewson is famous as a blank, writer, artist, baseball player, or comedian. Alfred Noyes is famous as a blank, painter, poet, musician, sculptor, and the Brooklyn Nationals are called a blank, Giants, Orioles, Superbass, or Indians. To Goddard, the worst of these categories in terms of posing a threat eugenically would be the morons, as he believed that they could hide within a society, and despite their innate stupidity, were hard to detect. Due to this, Goddard feared that they would reproduce and pass their feeble-mindedness to the following generations, and thus pollute the American gene pool. He felt that the easiest way to detect them was by looking at the outliers in society. People like criminals, alcoholics, prostitutes, etc., were people whom he classified as well as morons. and felt that many immigrants fit this classification. In 1913, when he had tested immigrants at Ellis Island to test this theory, he found that, his words, the intelligence of the average third-class immigrant is low, perhaps a moron grade, and decided that immigration of recent years is of decidingly different character from the early immigration. We're getting the poorest of each race. His phrasing of we clearly indicates his we versus them standpoint and his desire to maintain America's purity. Another test that will be instrumental in the eugenics rush of the 20th century in showing origins of bias to minorities and neurodivergent individuals will be the SAT. Its origin and the creator of the test, Carl Brigham. Carl Brigham was a eugenicist and an avid believer in these IQ tests. Even in his book, A Study of American Intelligence, he argues that as Southern/Eastern Europeans, Black people, and Jewish people scored lower on these tests, which he connected to racial inferiority. Just like Goddard, he also believed in keeping these people from each other. In his book, he tells, "We may consider that the population of the United States is made up of 4 racial elements: the Nordic, the Alpine, the Mediterranean races of Europe, and the Negro. If these 4 types blend into the future into one general American type, then it's a foregone conclusion that this future blended American will be less intelligent than the present native-born American. For the general results of an admixture of higher and lower orders of intelligence must inevitably be the means between the two." Brigham's book was made with the bigoted purpose to classify over 1 million military recruits by their innate IQ, and this book would play a major part in creating the SAT in 1926. The College Board would go on to review this book and wanted a test that could be administered to a group of students as a way to identify and standardize the students who could go to their schools, even if they didn't attend affluent preparatory schools. In the end though, Brigham's test did nothing to solve this problem of theirs. So why talk about bias anyway? What purpose does it serve in talking about how bias originates and manifests into eternalized hatred for years to come? Well, these tests played a pivotal role in forming and creating lobbying for the Immigration Act of 1924, which was a system that effectively restricted immigration to the U.S. from Southern/Eastern Europe and additionally banned countries from Asian countries. To go more in detail, it restricted immigration from these areas by creating quotas so that no more than 2% of the number of people of a given nationality living in the U.S. could immigrate annually. They wouldn't explicitly use these intelligence tests to enforce this rule though. Rather, they would use the 1890 census to enforce it. This census was important in creating this act as it didn't create a blatant racist lens that told you straight up that these people were less smarter than these people due to their race, but it did address concerns at the time about a country changing its social and demographic landscape. In the U.S. Department of State's words, to preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity. Using a graph from the 1890 census that talked about the nativity of foreign-born population in 1890, we can see that many Western and Northern European countries like Germany, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, and Scotland all have more than 2% of their population living in the United States, whereas Southern/Eastern countries like Russia, Italy, China, and Poland all had less than 2% of their population living in the United States. The data used in the census and many more indicated how the quota system used to create the Immigration Act in 1924 minimized and excluded later immigrant groups. Of course, there was strong blowback and controversy over this idea and whether or not that this act wasn't made with racism in mind. One opinion cites that this act didn't use IQ testing or any of the many forms of eugenics propaganda that I haven't even mentioned in this video as data worthy of forming this act. This was their reasoning, as they believed that the overlapping test score distributions of these tests showing eugenicists thought would have been problematic for creating the act anyway. They also believed that the congressional record during the case didn't document anything meaningful about intelligence test results and whether or not they should be used to determine one's citizenship status. The latter opinion believed that the IQ test results didn't need to play a defined role in forming the act, but that it was definitely taken into consideration. From gathering data 30 years ago, which revealed 2 different Americas that not only positioned minorities as less prominent, but also compared them in a flawed test that conflated innate intelligence with a knowledge of American culture. All in all, this act wasn't just the only thing that came out of these testings, though. These testings work to promote discrimination through sterilizations and institutionalizations as well, where minorities and neurodivergent people were subjected to brutal treatment. Cases like Buck vs. Bell in 1927, where Carrie Buck was forcibly and involuntarily sterilized in a Virginia state colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded after being declared feeble-minded. It was in this case where hateful rhetoric was spewed out by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, a Supreme Court member. In his words, "It is better for all of the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestingly unfit from continuing their kind." The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Of course, there is strong blowback and controversy over this idea and whether or not this act wasn't made with racism in mind. One opinion cites that this act didn't use IQ testing or any of the many forms of eugenics propaganda that I haven't mentioned in this video as data worthy of forming this act. This was their reasoning, as they believed that the overlapping test score distributions of these tests showing eugenicists thought would have been problematic enough for creating the act anyway. They also believed that the congressional record during this case didn't document anything meaningful about intelligence tests results and whether or not they should be used to determine one's citizenship status. The latter opinion believed that the IQ test results didn't need to play a defined role in forming the act, but it definitely was taken into consideration. From gathering data from 30 years ago, which revealed 2 different Americas not only positioned minorities as less prominent, but also compared them in a flawed test that conflated innate intelligence with a knowledge of American culture. Alongside hateful rhetoric like this coming from powerful people, we have repetition of harm. The state of California recorded between the years 1909 to 1979 that they've sterilized around 2,000 people without those people's consent, mostly in mental institutions and prisons. This practice ended in 1979 for state hospitals and 2010 for state prisons. Additionally to this, between 2006 and 2010, an expose from the Center of Investigative Reporting revealed that 148 women were sterilized without proper approval, and a separate state audit found that the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation oversaw the illegal sterilization of 144 inmates from 2005 to 2013. Education is power, and through federal policy is how we as a society operate and facilitate this power. These examples show how education can be used to manipulate and harm others into thinking that they're less than. Additionally, it creates and builds an historic and systemic bias for decades to come. This doesn't mean that education and learning are volatile and untrustworthy, but it should make you want to dig deeper and ask the why for everything.